Political scientists often describe Latin America's early political parties as elite parties because the upper class was the primary group in society that founded, organized, and led these parties. And in return, the parties largely represented the interests of their upper class leaders. At the same time, though, the vast majority of people who voted for these parties during the mid-19th century came from the lower strata of society. Not only the middle class, but also peasants, rural peons, and urban artisans. In the next two videos, we are going to unpack some of the reasons why lower class citizens would vote for parties that were founded for the purpose of advancing elite interests. And we are going to start today by examining a concept called traditional clientelism. The term clientelism refers to the exchange of benefits for political support. Here, the benefits could include material benefits like cash or food. They could also include public or private employment, or even political favors performed by government officials. Political support conventionally refers to the other person's vote, but it could also include non-electoral forms of support, such as attendance at political rallies or protests. Nowadays, political scientists often think of clientelism as a form of market exchange. A voter sells their vote to a politician in exchange for cash or a favor, in a one-off economic transaction that ends as soon as the vote has been cast and the payment has been received. Well, the type of clientelism that we are going to be focusing on today in this video is a much older type of ongoing relationship known as traditional clientelism. Traditional clientelism involves exchanges of political support that are embedded in broader traditional social relationships between a patron and a client. Traditional clientelism was pervasive in rural Latin America during the 19th century, and it was strongly associated with the hacienda, or large agricultural estate. Under traditional clientelism, the client is a peasant or peon who is locked in a long-term relationship of dependency with a single patron, who is typically a wealthy landowner who gives the peasant the things that the peasant needs in order to survive. The patron offers their client their protection. They may also provide the client with employment or access to farmland and tools, and in return, the client is expected to do certain things for the patron. They may be asked to perform labor on the patron's hacienda, or pay rent or tribute in the form of crops, and the client may also be required to vote the way that the patron tells them to vote. In contrast to the market exchange form of clientelism, these traditional clientelistic relationships have a much wider scope and a longer duration. Under traditional clientelism, the client provides the patron with both political and non-political services on a routine basis and for an extended period of time. And in the Latin American context, both the patron and client roles would often be inherited by the participants' children and passed through the generations. When we zoom out beyond a single pair of patrons and clients, we see a pyramidal structure that reinforces the inequality in these relationships. Each client has only a single patron, and it may be difficult for them to find another patron if they are ever forced to leave the hacienda. But on the other hand, the patron has many other clients. And from the patron's perspective, any one client is completely expendable. If the client is being uncooperative or disrespectful, the patron can simply cast the client out and rely on his other clients. The hacienda economy had developed in Latin America during the colonial period, but it still encompassed a relatively small share of the rural population during this time. and large swaths of the rural population were still fairly autonomous from the landed elite by the time of independence. During the late colonial period, indigenous villages had become fairly skilled at fighting back against the colonial era forced labor regimes, using a combination of collective action and the colonial legal system itself. Many of these villages had also gained enough communal land that their populations were able to subsist largely on their own without the need for any patron. Some Latin American countries had also developed a class of small-scale independent farmers who were predominantly mixed race or mestizo. Small farming was especially common on the frontiers of the colonial empire, but even in the other parts of the empire, it was possible for colonial subjects to gain access to plots of land, either through official land grants from the crown or by staking out common land that had not yet been claimed by anybody. Finally, in some countries, a significant share of the rural workforce was still enslaved until the second half of the 19th century. None of these three economic systems were very suitable for traditional clientelism because the indigenous communal farmers and independent farmers were far too autonomous, while the slaves were not nearly autonomous enough. Traditional clientelism thrives in that middle ground where the client is legally free but economically dependent on the patron. However, around the time of Latin American independence, all three of these systems are either eliminated or severely disrupted, and they are partially replaced by peonage systems that are much more conducive for traditional clientelism, such as tenant farming and rural wage labor. Many of the small farmers did not have legal title to their land, and they end up getting thrown off of their land during the mid-19th century as Latin American states adopt formal property rights regimes that concentrate much of the farmland and ranch land into the hands of a small number of wealthy and politically connected elite families. The indigenous villages are initially a bit more resilient, but they eventually come under attack during the second half of the 19th century as Latin American liberal governments abolish collective or corporate ownership of land in favor of individual ownership. Most of the indigenous villagers do not have the resources to purchase titles to the lands that they had been farming, and many of them are forced to become wage laborers in order to survive. The ranks of rural peons are also increased by the gradual abolition of slavery in Latin America between 1820 and 1888. Although a few countries adopt policies that encourage freedmen to migrate to the cities and towns, freed slaves throughout much of the region continue living in rural areas, often very close to their former plantation, and they join this class of rural wage laborers and tenant farmers. These systems of rural wage labor and rural tenancy are much more conducive to traditional clientelism because the laborer and tenant have an employer or a landlord on whom they now depend for their basic economic survival. And this employer or landlord becomes their patron. As degrading as it might be to go from being a small farmer or rancher to becoming a peon who lives and works on the patron's estate, many peons during this era nevertheless work hard to remain on the hacienda because they understand that the alternative is even less appealing. In a pre-industrial society where much of the land is owned by wealthy men like your patron, the main alternative to living on the hacienda is to live in some sort of shanty town or informal settlement, either in a rural area or on the outskirts of a larger city. By living in a shantytown, you might retain more control over your life, but your life would also tend to be much more precarious. It would be a struggle just to put food on your plate on a regular basis. Another factor that adds to the precariousness of life outside of the hacienda is the fact that rural Latin America is often an extremely dangerous and violent place during the 19th century. Latin American states are still pretty weak at this time, and they often have only tenuous control over much of their national territory. And when you combine a weak state with a displaced and dispossessed rural population, you tend to end up with banditry and other forms of rural violence. And this violence offers the rural poor an additional reason to seek out a patron, because the patron is not only their employer and landlord, but also their protector. On the hacienda, you are dependent and subservient, but you are also safe and generally well fed. In exchange for this protection, the peon would perform various services for the patron, including agricultural labor on the hacienda. However, these patron-client relationships also have a non-economic dimension as well, and the peon is also expected to defer to the patron on various other social and political matters that are not directly related to their employment. Among other things, the peon would be expected to vote the way that the patron instructs them to vote. Remember that voting is not secret at this moment in history, so it is pretty easy for the patron to verify how you voted. On election day, your patron would often be the one who takes you and his other clients to vote as a large group. He would hand you the physical ballot that lists the candidates that you are voting for, and he might even be standing right behind you when you put this ballot in the ballot box. The patron is making your voting decision for you, and you are merely carrying out his instructions. In countries where we have detailed granular voting data during this era, we often see cases where there might be two adjacent haciendas separated by a road or a fence, and on election day, everybody who lives on one hacienda will vote for one party, and everyone who lives on the hacienda next door will vote for the other party. This kind of homogeneity in vote choice among the people who live in the same place is a strong indication that their vote is being controlled by the patron or by some other authority. And we see this pattern continue in some Latin American countries well into the 20th century. In effect, the patron owns a whole block of votes, the votes of his clients. And this block of votes adds to his social status and his political importance within his political party. It is one of the bargaining chips that he can use to lobby his party's politicians or even launch a political career of his own. In addition to voting, the patron may also require his clients to participate in non-electoral forms of political participation, such as serving in partisan militias that are aligned with the patron's party. As we are going to see in some of the upcoming videos in this series, nearly every country in Spanish America is facing frequent civil wars fought along party lines throughout the mid-19th century, and the rank-and-file foot soldiers in these partisan armies are typically rural peons who are mobilized into this partisan violence by their patron. The strength of these patron-client relationships in rural Latin America is one of the key factors that makes this partisan violence possible, because it is through these traditional patron-client ties that the elite parties are able to mobilize ordinary citizens into these elite conflicts. The last question that I want to consider in this video is, what is so wrong with clientelism from a normative standpoint? Isn't it a good thing that the economic elite is offering poor people stable employment and protection? So why do social scientists usually talk about clientelism as if it is a bad or undesirable thing? Apart from the obvious coercive aspects of these relationships, the main thing that makes clientelism so insidious is that it messes with the accountability feedback loop in democratic politics. The idealized way that electoral democracy is supposed to work is that citizens choose the officials who occupy positions of power, and then those officials are supposed to enact policies that are in the citizens' general interests. If the officials neglect to do this, then they will be voted out of power in the next election and replaced with somebody better. But when a substantial share of the population is selling or trading their vote to their patron, this accountability relationship becomes distorted. Now the patron controls the citizens' votes, so the patron is the one who decides who the governing officials will be, and those officials will tend to govern in the interest of the patron rather than the population as a whole. And since the patron is, in this case, a wealthy landowner, this means that the policies that the government pursues are likely to reflect the class interests of this landed aristocracy rather than the rural masses. This is one of the reasons why a landed elite that consists of just a couple hundred wealthy families is able to dominate Latin American political systems for so long. Both the government and the voters themselves are beholden to this elite. The rural peons or clients do get something important out of this arrangement. They get protection, housing, employment, and various other things that are necessary for their material survival. But in return, they are required to vote for political parties that are going to entrench the same inequalities and insecurities in rural life that forced them to seek the protection of the patron in the first place. In exchange for having their short-term material needs provided for by their patron, the rural masses are essentially being asked to give up their right to demand deeper structural reforms that might improve their material conditions in the longer term.